Hi, my name is Dave Danning. I'm from the Massachusetts Teachers Association, Governor Weld's favorite organization. I had a question about the funding issue. This can be directed to both gentlemen, or if Senator Birmingham would prefer to answer, that's fine as well. As you know, the foundation budget itself was put together well before the content of ed reform, well before the curriculum frameworks, well before MCAS, etc. There was a Foundation Budget Review Commission in the law that's supposed to meet every 3 years. In 20 years, there have been 2+ commissions. We've really never systematically looked at the question as, what do we need to provide an adequate education to all kids, given the content of ed reform? Not given what Ed Moskovich came up with in 1989, but given the actual content of ed reform. So I'm just wondering, what do you think the next, what if anything, what do you think the next step should be in looking at the foundation budget itself? Thanks.
Yes, I made brief reference to the analysis of the Mass Budget and Policy Center, which has come to the conclusion that the foundation budget, in terms of its funding, has become superannuated. One thing we didn't anticipate, for instance, was the extraordinary health care costs that are borne by our school districts. And I haven't done the primary research, but the Mass Budget and Policy Center has concluded that our current foundation budget cannot be satisfied by current levels of funding. So I think that before we revisit the foundation budget, which would be perfectly appropriate after 20 years, we ought at least to fund the current foundation budget at levels that allow it to be implemented as it had been planned. We're falling short in that category. So before we have to revisit the components of the foundation budget, I think we should fully fund the budget as presently constituted, but perfectly open to looking at a reformulation of the budget. After 20 years, it's not disgraceful to say that we ought to revisit and reconsider certain initiatives to see if we had it right or if we could make it better.
Yep. Further to that point, I'm a big believer in zero-based budgeting, which is starting every year from scratch and assuming an appropriation of 0, as opposed to, as they do in Washington, assuming last year's appropriation plus 5%. A cut in Washington is growing at 6% instead of 11%. But if you do engage legitimately in zero-based budgeting, then you question every program. And I think what's gone before will make it obvious that I think that if you can guarantee that education dollars are spent in the classroom, it's very hard to see a higher priority than creating a quality education for our children. Just reading the Massachusetts Constitution would lead you to that result. So I think education spending is going to be a gainer if you indulge in that kind of exercise. I kind of agree that there are some other costs out there that could bear some examination. I'm haunted by the idea that there's 90% of the healthcare dollar in this country is spent on the last 6 months of life, and 50% is spent in just a relatively few days at the end of life. That's serious money. When I last looked, education was about 14% of the budget spending, and healthcare was about 16 going on 18%. I think those percentages may be higher today. But I think there's a lot that could be done combing the budget to find money, even in the absence of increasing tax revenue, which I understand we may be fortunate enough to be experiencing, to shovel some more of those dollars into the classroom.
Good morning. My name is Carolyn Lyons. I'm president of Strategies for Children. We are a statewide organization focused on ensuring children have access to high-quality early ed and can read proficiently. My question is about early ed. What were the discussions about it back in '93? Governor Weld, you talked about outcomes for children. Third grade reading, the MCAS is our first universally administered benchmark of children's success, and our rates have remained stagnant in third grade MCAS scores, English language arts, since MCAS were first administered. Among low-income children, about 60% cannot read well by third grade, and that's a critical predictor of future success in school and in life. We know the achievement gap is evident before kindergarten, and we've made no progress in early ed funding. You mentioned that funding for education on an inflation-related basis is stagnant. We've in fact decreased education, early education funding since FY01 by 29%. So hoping you could speak a little bit to what the discussions were and what you think the work should be going forward.
Candidly, my recollection is we focused on K through 12, not early education. And that may well have been a mistake, because there is loads of studies and literature which suggests that the achievement gaps that we lament are actually knowledge gaps. And those knowledge gaps start to form within days of birth. And poor kids tend to have less access to language and background information than privileged kids. And so that when they present themselves for school as 5-year-olds, they are already well behind more privileged kids. So as a matter of philosophy, I would support expanded spending on early education. I mean, there are extraordinary studies, I forget the name of it, where privileged kids had something like 3,000 words directed to them a day, whereas poor kids had 600 words directed to them, and the words themselves were different. The poorer kids were just being commanded, and the more privileged kids were having more open conversations. And this has a cognitive effect on the development of the young kids' brains. And so I think we can't, one thing I discovered in legislating ed reform, and I said that something about holding all stakeholders accountable. Well, one stakeholder that's hard to hold accountable is parents. It's hard to make a law saying you must be a good parent. And in recognition of that, I think it behooves the state to have earlier and earlier interventions, recognizing that some parents are not capable of providing the background information that we would like them to, and I would support earlier and earlier interventions. Of course, I must say, it's easy for me. I'm out of politics now. I used to be chair of Ways and Means. And it's easy for me to say I support that too. But as a philosophical matter, I think you're spot on, and I think investments in early education are likely to bring great returns.
Well, is this live? I do agree with Senator Birmingham again. I mean, I think the notion that knowledge is at the core here is spot on, and knowledge is a thing. You know, if you never read Thucydides, you wouldn't have an opportunity to reflect on what it means to have a possession for always that just comes from a book. There's a lot of research suggesting, as indicated, that the human brain, the human mind, is largely formed by age 3 as a result of what it receives during those early years. It's difficult to formulate how increased government funding is going to reach every family in the United States. You know, your first line of resistance does need to be the parent. The amount of money that would be required to have that kind of intervention for every family is simply staggering. I was on the board for 7 years of the Harlem Children's Zone in New York, run by a guy named Jeff Canada and funded largely by my pal Stanley Druckenmiller, who was a George Soros guy and a person able to make contributions between $18 and $36 million a year to the budget of the Harlem Children's Zone. I mention this because the mission of the Harlem Children's Zone was to reclaim Harlem block by block. And essentially, it began even before birth. We had an outfit called the Baby College. We would take these 18-year-old women and begin instructing them in the responsibilities of motherhood when they were 4 months pregnant. And then when they gave birth, they and their baby would go to the Baby College. And the Harlem Children's Zone was with those families every step of the way from the prenatal stage. And guess what? The kids all went to Ivy League colleges. It was really great. And 125th and Madison was, you know, a glittering block because everybody there had all that attention. And the parents had to sign contracts, shades of standards and accountability. They had to sign contracts saying they would keep their place spotless and they would shoo away the drug dealers if they tried to sit on the steps, and they would make improvements, and in return, guess what? The Harlem Children's Zone would help them get a low-interest mortgage so they could afford their own house. So it was marvelous. It just cost a staggering amount of money. So in principle, with you. How you get here from there, you need more Stanley Druckenmillers and Jeff Canadas, I guess.
To the table here, please. I'm going to introduce Sarah Mead, who is going to moderate the panel and introduce the panelists. Sarah is an associate partner with Bellwether Education Partners, a nonprofit organization working to improve educational outcomes for low-income students. She writes and conducts policy analysis on issues related to childhood education in K-12 schools. I read her all the time. Her work has been featured in the Washington Post, New York Times, USA Today. She's a frequent contributor on TV and radio as well. She has worked at the New America Foundation, Education Sector, the Progressive Policy Institute, and the United States Department of Education. She serves on the District of Columbia Public Charter School Board, which not only selects charters to move forward, but also holds them accountable. And she's also on the board of Democrats for Education Reform, a fabulous organization. She holds a bachelor's degree in public policy from Vanderbilt. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Jim. So Senator Birmingham has already cited many of the contributions of our distinguished panel today, so I'm going to be very brief in my introductions. To my far left on the panel is David Driscoll, who was the 22nd Commissioner of Education for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and in that role oversaw the development of the state's curriculum, MCAS, the development of the state's school and district accountability system, and the development of the educator certification test and new licensure regulations. To his right is Michael Sentance, who has worked on education policy issues for over 2 decades. He was the chief education advisor to both Governors Weld and Cellucci, and in that role developed many of the Weld-Cellucci administration's education policies from early childhood through workforce development, including key provisions of the Education Reform Act. To his right is Sandra Stotsky, Emerita Professor of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas and the 21st Century Chair in Teacher Quality. She was Senior Associate Commissioner in the Massachusetts Department of Education from 1999 to 2003, where she played a key role in formulating approaches to standards and teacher quality. And then to my immediate left, Tripp Jones co-leads New Profit, guiding the organization's plans for future growth and impact. He spent a number of years in Massachusetts state government and politics, including serving as the staff director director for the committee that drafted Massachusetts' landmark 1993 Education Reform Act. So we primarily this morning are going to have a discussion, but before we begin that discussion, I wanted to give each of you 2 to 3 minutes to just reflect a little bit on the impact that the Education Reform Act has had, some of the key lessons we've learned, and some of the potential implications for the state going forward. Commissioner Driscoll, would you like to begin?
Thank you, Sarah. And it's great to see so many people in this audience that played such a key role. There are people individually who get a lot of accolades, as Governor Weld and Senator Birmingham should, but it also was very much a team effort across the board. I'd like to, Alan Safran from my staff, by the way, until we hired Sandra Stotsky, the smartest guy I ever had, so tremendous vocabulary, so I used him to review all memos from Senator Birmingham and Governor Weld. And he would translate many of the words that, you only stumped him once, Governor, but it was a doozy of a word. I want to answer, so Alan said to me, you're going to talk about the past, or you're going to talk about the future. So my hope is we'll naturally celebrate some of the past, but in light of what's happening in the future, as in the idea of hoping to help figure out what it was that worked so well that others should be emulating. And so I want to answer the first question I'm asked, no matter where I am, which is, how come you leaped to the front of the country in 2005, and a couple of years later, no one followed you? And I think the unfortunate answer to that question, many reasons, the lack of leadership in other states, etc. We had this remarkable coming together of leaders and groups and so forth. It really was remarkable. And people like Jack Rennie and others deserve tremendous credit for helping do that as legislators, leaders, and so forth. But I think that, unfortunately, one of the main reasons that the Massachusetts success story did not get replicated is something I think we all supported, or many of us supported, and that is No Child Left Behind. Great in its concept, meant to, in many ways, follow the Massachusetts story. Governor Bush at the time, and then President Bush, certainly understood the Massachusetts story. Great input from Senator Kennedy and others. But there were 3 fundamental flaws of the law that did it in. The first was this whole idea of AYP, which, and by the way, we had adopted the Texas system. So we had AYP. We had the accountability aspects of No Child Left Behind before it became law. But we put it out to 2020, back in the mid-90s, and when they passed the law in 2000, whatever year, 4, they used 2014. Now, I could never get anybody to tell me why they picked that number. They needed to pick a number that wasn't too far out, because then it would go to the next Congress and whatever, but they knew it couldn't be too close. And that was just an unrealistic number. And I always like to say ours was the great hypotenuse in the sky out to 2020. People could actually make AYP. You could go into a school in Brockton and say, look, you only got to make this much. But 2020, it was unrealistic. And the way you got there was open to interpretation. So I used to call it the field hockey stick. Some of these states had a theory, well, we're not going to be able to make great progress right at the beginning because, you know, our people have to get used to the new standards. So we're going to have this slow rise, and then we're going to jump. And so they would build, well, of course, it never happened. So that was fundamental flaw number 1. Fundamental flaw number 2 was that, and this was an insistence of you talk about the grand bargain, Senator. I'm told this was the trade-off between vouchers and not vouchers, was President Bush's insistence that we test every grade. And that doubled our testing. And that really was a problem in many ways. Understood the reason for it was to have annual growth and growth models and that kind of thing, but it could have been developed in better ways. And then finally, of course, the most important flaw of all was that while they used the word proficiency, it wasn't defined as NAEP proficiency, and every state was allowed to set its own standard. So a state that had 12% of its kids proficient under NAEP. Under its state test, had 88% of its kids proficient. Secretary Duncan likes to call it the race to the bottom. So that really was the undoing of, had they set proficiency at NAEP, now they, as part of the law, they did use NAEP as an independent verifier, according to the law. And every year, I chair NAGB that oversees NAEP. Every year we put out the study that says, here's NAEP, here's Illinois, here's whatever. And of course, Massachusetts is about the only state that's even close. So those fundamental flaws allowed people off the hook. I want to talk just quickly about two things that I think deserve some note beyond the usual, the grand bargain and so forth. Within the grand bargain was a real balance and things that could get in the way. And I find the debate over the Common Core a distraction and in the way. I wish people would settle that. I'll simply say it's not true that the new Common Core abandons Dickens, but it's also not true that it doesn't need to explain better the aspects of informational text and so forth. So there was a real balance, and I think we need to think about that, and the right people had the right input in certain areas. And finally, there was this, what is often called push-pull, tight-loose, this balance between setting standards. Had the federal government set proficiency in NAEP, whether it was 2014 or whatever, that would have made a huge difference. And I think we got that right. And I worry about that because it is true that the legislature deserves great credit, and this foundation budget, and Senator Birmingham was remarkable in his efforts. Remember, we had a budget one year that ran all the way to the fall. And after all is said and done, and I'm sure it's not a secret anymore, that was about education reform and him standing strong for education. That's what that whole thing was about. But it wasn't just that. It was also this issue of bringing people along, and that's what I think we're missing today. 44 states adopted the Common Core. They're lemmings. 35 of them had no idea what the hell they were doing. They just did it as the governor said to go along with the president. They didn't really understand what they were doing. Just as bad is some of the criticism, which is not really based in fact. Those kinds of things didn't happen here. Here we had a proper, I think, balance between bringing people along, input from teachers, etc. Thank you.
Michael Sentance.
I'm glad everyone got to see Governor Weld here talk because now you know what morning staff meeting, what a terrifying experience morning staff meeting was like. I do want to say one note about both of those individuals, though, that I both worked for and worked with in that time period, and that was the courage that both of them showed in embracing this law. Because it is a complex law and there are difficult things. And I remember actually briefing or being part of the briefing for Governor Weld where he leaned back and said, well, let's follow the communist route, you know, and I said, okay, well, there's that, you know, it was a, and just to be clear, I mean, it's kind of an, for those of you who understand the law and the funding, those aren't the communities that elected Governor Weld in 1990. And so taking that path was not something that was going to get more votes for him in those communities. So, and having spent a great deal of time in 91, and 92, and 93 going out in the evenings to town meetings and so forth in those kind of communities and hearing from them, you're not giving us any money. I mean, I've fully understood that conversation. And the other person is, of course, Tom Birmingham, who I think had an enormous amount of courage in embracing all of the reform provisions, including the charter schools. And I think that cost him terribly politically. I think that, you know, when he ran for governor, I don't think you got the endorsement on education issues from that group that's up on Beacon Hill, you know. And I think that is just so incredibly foolish, because there's nobody in I think at least in the last 50 years, maybe 100 years, in Massachusetts history that has done more for education, both early childhood, K-12, and public higher education, than Tom Birmingham. And I think that to not recognize the courage to make that a priority at the state level is just ludicrous. But I also I want to say I sort of echo Dave's comments about the Massachusetts experience. One of the things that I got to do through the last decade was work for the U.S. Department of Education and travel a little bit around the country, talking to people and listening to what they're doing. And one of the things that I was surprised about was how few states were really serious about education reform. So I thought that when we were doing things here, that we were serious, that we actually meant what we said, that we were trying to improve education and that improve children's lives. And that just was not true. And time and again, you saw people making decisions which were clearly comfortable, clearly easy, but also very clearly not going to change things. And I never understood why states, went down that path. And not that everybody studies boring reports like the NAEP reports quite as seriously as Dave would, That's great, More pictures. But in 2005, Rhode Island Hispanic scores in 8th grade math were the worst in the country, the worst, below Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, the worst. Now, Rhode Island spends as much or more money than we do, has smaller class sizes than Massachusetts does, not perhaps every year, but most years. And yet they have that kind of performance. And that's hard to understand when if those students traveled up Route 95 just about 45 minutes, they would have jumped their math scores almost 2 years. That's craziness. But Rhode Island assiduously ignored Massachusetts as a model, and I have no explanation for that. And it was a source of constant, conversation with state leaders down there and so forth. And like Dave mentioned the Common Core and how states, didn't know what they were adopting. One of the things that I do is I end up as a finalist for many state commissioners' jobs around the country. I was a finalist in Kentucky. Kentucky was the first state to embrace the Common Core. And I was in an executive session with them a few days after they had adopted the Common Core. They hadn't even read it. They had no idea what it said. It wasn't in final form. And I said, how can you do that? That's one of the main tools you have to promote change in a state. And working with the state assessment and making sure that it's robust and so forth. But people are doing these things without the kind of conversation that we had in Massachusetts, without the kind of commitment to children that we've had in Massachusetts. And it's something that I find to be fascinating and just baffling.
Dr. Stotsky.
I will give my perspective from being in the Department of Education under Commissioner Driscoll at the time we were attempting to do something that helped me to understand what may be missing in today's vision of how to engage in education reform. Let me say that I, first of all, was the chief administrator of whatever kind of initiative had an academic component. I was sort of the in-house academic expert. So I was in charge of the pieces that related to academic quality. And I was now encountering, bit by bit, all the aspects of the Education Reform Act that had some relationship to doing something about academic matters. I was impressed, first of all, that the legislation was about raising the academic achievement of all students. It wasn't just pitched to one end. It was about doing something for the entire spectrum. And it did something else that's really seriously missing, and that is it had a lot to do with education schools. And so far, Common Core has had nothing directly to do with education schools. And until that piece is included, I'm going to mention some of the things that I was doing, because my first task that I was given was to revise those awful teacher licensing regulations. You dumped it on me. The first thing you gave me to do.
You told me you were smart.
It was an unreadable document. I had never read any such thing in my life, and I had been doing a lot of reading in my academic life, and I couldn't understand one regulation after another. I had to rely on this wonderful small staff who could explain to me what some of the things in those old regulations actually meant, because they all were important details, but only for people who had PhDs in licensing regulations. None, in other words. So what I appreciated in this act was systematic thinking that began with having standards for students and having assessments for students, but there were a number of pieces to the teacher education component that made a huge difference. Now, they all can't be done today, again, because in some cases they have already been done elsewhere. But let me just mention the things that I had to wrestle with and that I realized that unless we raise the academic quality of our teaching corps, we're not going to get far in anything we do in K-12, whether it's called No Child Left Behind, Common Core, or anything else. One of the items I had to wrestle with was this requirement that all prospective teachers had to major in an instructional subject they taught. At least it was my understanding that came from MIRA, changing the fact that many of them, if not most, had been education majors. They could have a double major, but at least they had to have some academic major. There were end games played with that one, but at least there was a way we could go after raising academic experiences by the fact that they at least had to have one and the main major in an academic subject. Then there was a two-step process for licensing teachers. First initial, which would cover all those undergraduate people who came out of ed schools, and that second part called professional, it had different names, might be a master's degree in something, typically education, but it did mean more education. Then it was 2 licensure tests that were required. This was very unusual because even that famous provision in Title II of the Higher Education Act didn't require 2 tests. One was for teacher skills, we call that the COMLIT test, and the other was the subject matter test. Boy, did I have a great time with that subject matter test in 40 different areas. I learned how to speak to people who are academic experts in all of those areas, even though I knew a lot about many of them, not science and math particularly. But those subject matter tests, and it was very clear in the statute that they were to be subject matter tests, not pedagogical tests. So teachers had to know the subject they taught. Now, the wrestling and compromising that took place about how much they had to know and where you set the cut score are major issues to this day. But at least it was clear, and we know from research, I was on the National Mathematics Advisory Panel, we do know from research that the only characteristic that research can find that relates some component of the schooling that kids experience to their achievement is teachers' knowledge of the subject they teach. Duh, common sense. Wouldn't it seem that if you don't know math, how can you teach math or science and so forth? But that we had to find through research. Does it mean that this is what we now emphasize, or that the new merged accreditation agency called CAEP, that's the acronym, is going to say that students who want to become teachers must have clear tests of their academic knowledge of whatever they want to teach? We still haven't gotten there. But that teacher subject test was, for me, almost the most important thing I was responsible for developing or overseeing ahead of the student K-12 standards. The other there was another couple of pieces, and then I'll stop, because I was really impressed by all these small pieces because they amount to a lot. One was that licenses had to be renewed every 5 years. That was a new idea. You couldn't get a license for life, which I had gotten years ago when I became an elementary teacher here in Massachusetts. Under MIRA, you had to have your license renewed every 5 years. This meant professional development had to take place, and that led to content-oriented development for teachers in particular. So there were a lot of pieces that related to teacher education and to upgrading our teacher corps. And to me, that was and remains one of the major reasons accounting for the success of Base 8 students, and probably may remain one of the unaccounted reasons for why no other state followed through. I find that interesting, because to cope with your education schools is like coping with what? I'll let you come up with the right metaphor. But that's what every state has to face. How do you deal with your education schools that produce most of your teachers, despite all of the alternatives that are now available, including Teach for America? They will never come close to the number that come out of our education schools themselves. That's all for now.
Tripp Jones.
All right, thank you, Sarah. It is great to be here, and I think I'll just start by saying what an incredible privilege it was to have the opportunity to work with the two guys who spoke earlier this morning. It's a real treat to be able to sit and listen and remind oneself of how lucky we were, extremely lucky, to have the caliber of those two guys and another that I'll speak about in a second, doing what they were doing. And I could see looking around the room how much fun everybody had hearing the stories, hearing these guys reflect back, but that was special. And as a Commonwealth, we should celebrate that and remember how important that dimension was to what we were doing. You know, I'm here in many ways this morning wearing the hat of my old boss, Mark Roosevelt, who is extremely sorry that he was not able to be here. I think one of the great losses that Massachusetts has had to cope with over the last few years is Mark going off and doing what he did in Pittsburgh and now in Ohio. It's a shame we don't have his voice here this morning. As I know Governor Weld and Senate President Birmingham would recall, he added just a little bit of spice to that whole experience, and I know he's sorry not to be here as well. I heard Commissioner Driscoll talk about how he had to have the smart guys read the memos from Birmingham and Weld's team, and I don't know, I'll turn to my pal John Schneider over here, who was my teammate on the House side. I don't know what happened to the House memos there, Commissioner Driscoll, but John and I will probably get over that. And you know, anyway, it was a privilege to work with so many great people, many of whom are here. I'm going to kill a few seconds just acknowledging some. You know, some have already been mentioned. I won't mention others. I see Dom Slowey, who also worked with Governor Weld. John, I've mentioned. My teammate, Charlie Chippio, obviously played such an important role in shaping the debate around a lot of these issues. I see Senator Hicks, who played such an important role in the legislature. Jay Kaufman. I'm going to miss some for sure. And I also want to acknowledge the role of organized labor. Haven't always agreed with them, have had plenty of battles, but they played an important role as well. We had an extraordinary process that had a huge network of people who were engaged in this thing over 2 years. How many town meetings? 250 plus all over the state. And organized labor and the teachers' unions, despite having pushed back on a number of things that a lot of us felt were very important, played a very important role in helping and contributing to that debate, and we should acknowledge that as well. And want to make that point. I see Bob Gaudette, Sue Cooper should be acknowledged as well. and I'm sorry if I'm not naming others, but that was a key part of it. The team of people that contributed to the process from the top all the way through every organization was important. I also ought to mention Ted Constant and Noah Berger, who worked for Senator Birmingham, who played such an important role, and others. So anyway, I want to just start by saying, first of all, as I referenced the leadership, we've got to reflect and remember how incredibly lucky we were that this thing could all come together the way it did. I participated in some other events celebrating the success of this effort, and there's a lot to celebrate. But Governor Weld referenced the court case, and we often don't talk very much about that. And if it had not been for that court case, I think it might have been very, very much harder for us to have been in a position to have gotten what we got done. The leadership, the idea that at a given moment in time, after a heck of a lot of work, there was so much alignment that had come together to rally around such a comprehensive package of what has already been described. Extraordinary. The Boston Globe must have declared that and the Herald declared that law was going to be dead, I don't know how many times, half a dozen, 8 times. I had my pals in Washington working with the Clinton administration saying, what the hell are you doing staying in Massachusetts? Keep working on this law. Heard it all the time. But the degree to which people stayed at it, the lineup of people who all came together and agreed, the participation of so many people outside of government, not just inside of government. We had Goodwin Procter drafting a lot of the law. The business community, we mentioned Jack Rennie, but there were many others that ought to be acknowledged as well. So Bill Edgerly, we could go on about a number of people in that world. So extraordinary alignment that you just so rarely see happen, and that we're not seeing happen enough these days with regard to legislative efforts at the state and federal level. So I want to talk about that. I agree with what was said about the importance of both the money and the accountability, but in looking back and thinking about the future, one of the things that I'm most proud of and that I think was most important as it relates to this law was that we ushered in an era of innovation and experimentation in getting that law done. People have talked about the importance of charter schools. There are other elements of innovation that was provoked by a lot of the provisions that were put into the law that are extremely important, that may in many ways just beginning to get traction and just beginning to give us some benefits from what was done. So that was incredibly important, and we should celebrate as well. Just in thinking a little bit about going forward, one of the things that I reflect on, two areas that I think we perhaps missed huge opportunities to try to address, and we know why we did because we couldn't do everything. First was dealing with our special education population of students. And we knew it at the time. We said that we expected there would be court cases and suits that would force the state to have to do more to help students who learn differently to have the support and the services necessary to be able to achieve and perform at the level of proficiencies that were going to be expected. We didn't do enough on that, and we should talk about that. Second thing that I would say, and it's already been referenced, and I'll thank my buddy Carolyn Lyons back there, Cal, for bringing it up, is the early childhood education piece. Extremely important, and obviously I think when we sat around and talked about doing this law, looked at each other and acknowledged that we just simply didn't have the resources or even the knowledge about what could be done on that. Final point, and then I'll stop, Sarah, is I want to talk about a different kind of public education that, in reflecting back, I think we failed in a big way to appreciate and invest in. And that was the effort needed to educate the public more seriously about what we were doing when it came to our efforts to implement and put this law in place. There was a heck of a lot of press about it, but very little, in my view, strategic effort being made to get to ordinary citizens and parents. I now have 3 kids in the public schools, in the great Wayland public schools, a soon-to-be high schooler, a middle schooler, and a grade school student. I have the experience day in and day out of hearing parents and teachers talk about this law and the implications of what we did. And I fear constantly that we did not do anywhere near the work we needed to do to help people who were going to be paying an awful lot of attention to what was being done, to understand the context, the framework, and some sense of the specifics about what was being done and why. And I know a lot of people, including some up here on this panel, invested a lot of effort in trying to do that. But in looking back, we should have invested more resources and considerable more time and effort, in my view, in trying to make sure that there was going to be a greater understanding as we got to this point in what we were trying to do, what worked, what didn't, and so forth. And I fear that the consequence of that is, as we think about the next chapter of what can be done, we will be hamstrung in being able to make more progress. And while we reflect and we think about 20 years and all that we accomplished, there's a lot to celebrate, I'm struck by sitting there thinking about how many students have gone through our system in the last 20 years and probably have not really benefited the way a lot of us would have hoped from a lot of what we were trying to do. And when I think about the pace at which we are making change, more broadly across the system as a whole, and we all talk about the importance of charter schools and the benefit of what's happened there, I'll be the first one to do it. We have not done enough to get change and reform and innovation to affect the vast majority of the classrooms in the schools where that is so desperately needed. And I think we ought to, as we think ahead, ask ourselves, as we're all getting grayer, losing some hair, moving along, that if we continue to move at the pace that we've been moving at, even with all the attention and all the resources, we are going to be in deeper and deeper trouble. And it's a shame, given how much we know about what really needs to get done. We know that now, and it's the same group of people in this state that have been working on this for a long time, and we have got to figure out how to move much, much, much faster. Stop there.
So I just want to take that point and build on it. You know, earlier this week I was at another panel that I was on in Washington where everybody was talking about how Massachusetts has so dramatically outperformed other states in terms of progress and absolute performance on NAEP in the past decade to 20 years. And one of the things that came up is that a number of other states have been starting to implement their own reforms in recent years, not necessarily hitting all the pieces of your education reform efforts, but hitting some of them, and we're starting to see some progress in places we hadn't seen it in the past. And so I'm curious, given that landscape, what does Massachusetts need to be thinking about and need to be doing right now to stay on the forefront and to maintain its place of leadership in the coming years?
Well, let me say, and first of all, I'm sure Mark Roosevelt wasn't shy in these meetings. He had a fine vocabulary of his own. We were very fortunate. I think when we think about Governor Weld, Senator Birmingham, Representative Roosevelt, we see these, think about visionaries, think about people that were tough, took strong stands, etc. But they're also very pragmatic. And so, you know, we talked about charter schools as an example, and there are many, many others. Things had to get negotiated. Jack Rennie was a master at it. And so I think what happens is things have their time. And what I think has to happen now is people have to seize the time. So a great example, I'll leave gay marriage out, a great example is special education. We had the law that said maximum feasible benefit. And the rest of the country had free and appropriate, FAPE. And every year, some courageous or foolish legislator would file a bill saying we'll go to FAPE. And thousands of special ed parents and kids would come into Gardner Auditorium and wheelchairs and whatever, and that would be the end of that. Well, guess what? One year, we actually changed it because the timing was right. So I think what has to happen today, and I think about the charter cap, it was not worth the battle at the time. And so the deal was struck, and it was the right thing. And that occurred in many, many other ways. And to the credit of these leaders, they came to agreement and then moved on. And that was very helpful. And then we revisited things as time went on. I remember revisiting the charter cap, and by the time the legislature, with a lot of influence from the teachers union, got done, the modest cap had union cards related to it and so forth and so on. So I think part of the issue here today is people have to stand strong and look at what the issues are today and deal with it and move things forward. It is time for something to happen in charter schools. They've proven themselves. Enough already. It's time to move on that issue. To Senator Birmingham's point, I'm waiting to see leaders today, Governor Patrick et al., say back to you, look, if Common Core results, or the PARC assessment, or Smarter Balance, whatever they are, comes out such that our kids aren't at the same level, we're not going down to Alabama. If the number of kids who are proficient or advanced on, or whatever they want to call their title, they have to define a college ready. That doesn't mirror MCAS, and we can't play there. So I think that's what's missing. I mean, I know there was an Ed Reform Act passed version a year ago, but it's pretty tepid. So I think it's time to continue to take on issues. Early childhood is one. This whole issue of why is it that the money's flat? Look at what we're spending in pensions, health care. People aren't stepping up to issues. It's happening across the country. Everybody's polarized. We need to get back to that leadership. There was a lot of context to get that kind of money, $2 billion in new monies. There are a lot of other issues that Governor Well fought for to see to it that that there was monies and not gobbled up by other programs, zero-based budgeting and so forth. So I think that's really, Sarah, what I see. People have to get very serious and show some tenacity.
I would like to add that there's another jewel in the Massachusetts crown that has not been given the kind of notice nationally that it deserves. That's our network of regional vocational technical schools, which a long time ago bit the bullet when the students first flunked, and it was very clear from Commissioner Driscoll and the Board of Education and others that yes, those students all had to take the same major subjects and the same MCAS tests that other kids were taking in the regular schools, but that this was a special network that was going to be available for alternative high school curriculum. And indeed, they bit the bullet, and most of them pass at a higher level than kids in the regular public schools, and there are waiting lists for most of these schools. This is not national policy. This is one of the really unfortunate problems at the national level, that there is no concept of alternative high school curricula. We could have specialized performing arts high schools, because I happen to be an amateur musician and I think there's a role for that. We could have we could have math and science dedicated high schools. We could have humanities, foreign language high schools, which we desperately need in this country, because fewer and fewer Americans learn any foreign language. Everyone speaks English everywhere. So that these could be alternative curricula options as long as everyone meets the basic subject in the same way, so that if they want to go on to college, they are eligible, and now over about 50% do from our voc tech schools. But what is common in most other countries, industrialized countries in the world, is simply an unknown concept in this country, and this is greatly to be deplored.
So just to add to that, so I mean, I think number one, we've got to take things that are working and making a difference and expand them. No question about it. high-performing charter schools, we should replicate the heck out of those and do it faster and more resources being invested in them. And there are other experiments as well that, you know, again, people have mentioned. We don't have a lot of time. I won't start going through the list, but absolutely got to replicate what's working. Second thing we got to do is shift more and more authority to the school level. We've got to put individual schools in a position where they can innovate and experiment and evolve faster in a more ambitious way. We're still having silly, stupid fights and impediments to letting teachers, principals who are qualified and capable to just make decisions and move on stuff that they know and want to do. I'm struck all the time by the number of innovative teachers and principals who will say, we want to be able to do this, and still are hung up and impeded from being able to make it happen. When I think about the next chapter of education reform, my vision of that ought to be everything that we're doing is trying to shift power and authority down to the individual school level, giving schools the ability to do what I'm describing. That ought to be a core component of our vision for the next phase of what we're trying to do. And then third, obviously, maintain our commitment to standards, meaningful standards in whatever form. And you could tell just from the comments earlier, there's a compromise that could be reached in making sure that Massachusetts doesn't walk away from what we have been recognized all over the place for having done in terms of having set the bar appropriately high. Got to do that. Got to maintain our investment in schools that need additional resources. And got to also make sure that as we continue to focus in Massachusetts on the things I'm describing, we do not lose our focus on high achievement and excellence and opportunities for real expansion of what we're able to provide in the way of opportunities for our highest performing students in this state, because that's always been a core component of what makes Massachusetts special. So I'll stop there, Sarah.
So I want to build on your second point really quickly. You know, school-based management was a component of the Education Reform Act that has been one that has largely not been implemented widely. I think only one district has really taken that and run with it. Curious why that hasn't been the case, but also, is there a role that the state should be taking right now to try to move the ball forward on that in new and different ways than have been tried to date?
You're looking at me. You want me to? I'll keep going. Thank you, Sarah. So, look, in shooting straight, we've got too many contracts and systems that just impede the ability for its administration. There's a whole bunch of reasons. Bureaucracy that get in the way of enabling that to happen. And you know, I'm looking at my pals in organized labor who are here. We have got to be able to do more in how we structure our contracts to be able to allow for individualized school decision making and movement around how they make progress in their schools and innovating and implementing change. Gotta do it. And you know, the exciting thing these days is I don't find too many people arguing against that at all. I would say so that's critical. And we've also got to have a different approach with regard to the administration that we have in our school systems. We've got to, I would argue, take the examples of where school systems have actually made change more effectively, done some dramatic change, publicize the heck out of it, and make an effort to help other school districts and those interested in this to understand what were the key elements that were required to make that happen.
Just to follow up a bit on Tripp's points, I think that the reason that it hasn't happened and the reason that, you know, it's something to be considered in the future is that we just haven't prepared principals and administrators in the appropriate way to take on those kind of roles and responsibilities. I mean, when you look at the way a lot of the charter school people are prepared, I mean, they are given a very different kind of preparation than you see in many of the ed schools. It's not an analog to an MBA. It's just you know, an education administration degree, which isn't quite the same thing. And you see the result of that in a lot of the early innovation schools. They're frankly built on failed models. And I don't think we're going to see the kind of change that one would hope for from those kinds of things, because they don't, frankly, it doesn't appear to me anyway, looking at it from a distance, that they are engaged in the kind of analysis that they should be in terms of what actually works and what should be employed and so forth. So that, if we want to encourage that kind of thing, and I think that there's a great deal of power to that model, then I think we have to do a whole lot more work in trying to change what the expectations are for our school managers, both on a school level and on a district level, and then try to build that capacity in the field, the people that are currently working there.
So Commissioner Driscoll mentioned the charter school cap, and we heard at the opening statements this morning that the really powerful performance of Massachusetts charter schools in terms of outperforming traditional public schools across the state, but also outperforming charter schools in other states, really at a level that we don't see anywhere else. And I'm curious about two things. One is, what has Massachusetts done that has enabled this very high record of charter school performance relative to the mediocre results we're seeing in most other states with large charter sectors? And what should other states be learning from what was done in Massachusetts? But then I think the second question is, given that Massachusetts has such high-performing charter schools and such a stellar track record in the sector as a whole, why has it been such a struggle over the cap, and why does the cap continue to stay in place?
Well, I think one of the main reasons that the charter initiative has worked well goes back to the basic law and the governance at the time. And remember, there was a Secretary of Education, and at the time, and there was divided responsibilities and so forth. So the key there, in my judgment, even after the Secretary's position was eliminated, it comes and goes, that position, as you know. When the charter office came into our department, we tried very hard to make sure that A, it was led by charter advocates, and B, it had a lot of autonomy. And I remember moving it onto my floor, which is a big deal in organizations, to make sure it had, it wasn't over in the annex across the street, like which is where they were going to put it. So I think the first thing is, if you look across the country, a lot of the sponsors are districts themselves. Think about that. And or other opportunities for people to just develop charters, some of whom have, unfortunately, motivations to make money. Here in Massachusetts, I think it was because of the law and because of the seriousness with which it was developed, we have a very strong accountability at the central state level, and great advocates for it. We didn't put the usual bureaucrats in charge. These were charter advocates. Interesting thing about charter advocates, if you really care about charter schools, then you're going to close the bad ones. You don't want the bad ones. And so I think that's part and parcel. As I look around the country, there's a lot of schools. Why they're not closed, I have no idea. So I think that whole thing comes back to the strength of the law.
Well, seeing as I was pretty much heavily involved in the chartering of the first charter schools and helping to set up some of that model, I completely agree with what Dave said, that we had some very, very good people working on these things. Scott Hamilton and Ed Kirby and Paul Herdman, who's down in Delaware now, and these are Jim, who? And we had, and these are people who really, were thoughtful about the analysis, and that we, were very clear about what the expectations were. That these were supposed to be high-performing schools. And when you see some of the things that other states are doing, you see them creating boutique schools. There's I don't know if it's still operating, but there's an equestrian charter school up in New Hampshire, which I'm sure is a delightful experience for all the students there, but it's not the high-performing kind of school that you really want to see. And we not only started with that, but the day that Jim Pizer and I came back from the opening of the Marblehead Charter School, which my recollection was the first, but South Shore says it is, I guess. I'm not sure. When I came back, I sat down with Paul Herdman, who was overseeing the operations of this, and I said, okay, we're going to have an answer for the question about who's overseeing these schools right now. We're going to have that figured out now, and we're going to have formative assessments of where they are today, and that is going to continue into a summative kind of assessment, and we're going to do these things, and we're going to bring in all of that built into a system that was both rigorous and directed specifically at that particular charter. And I think that our attention to that focus of seeing results, even though we hadn't had the MCAS put into place at that point, focusing on whether they were attentive to their charter, whether they were doing the right thing by moving their students ahead, how were they measuring that progress during the school year. All of those kind of conversations, I think, help build a rigorous assessment system of the charter schools that has both made the record in Massachusetts remarkably clean of fraud, which is something you see across the country in a number of states, and secondly, a level of academic performance which is remarkable and worthy of being replicated across the country.
Can I just quickly answer your second question? Sure. Is why it doesn't change? And it's just one of those lightning rod issues. I can remember we released a report on charter schools and how they were doing and so forth and so on. And immediately, the charter advocates came out and said, see, shows how great they are, look at these statistics, so forth and so on. The MTA came out and said, see, they cherry picked, they this and that. And I came up before the press and they asked me what I thought. I said, well, I guess I put out 2 reports. I mean, but it was the same report. And it's just you talk to very sincere people. It's one of those visceral issues. So obviously the legislature, up till now, the majority are swayed by a lot of their citizens their constituents who believe that they're not the right thing. It's too bad, but that's the reason.
Yeah, so a couple quick things. One, I think Mike made a very good point about the effort that's needs to be invested in principals and administrators. In one of my other lives, I'm on the board of a great national organization called New Leaders, which basically nationally is taking administrators and principals and training them and preparing them to do what we're talking about. So I see the benefit of that. But I would still say, Mike, that we've got a lot of good leaders at the school level and a lot of great teachers who are ready to roll and who want to make change, and it's still too darn hard for them to be able to do what they need to do, and we've got to address that. So on the charter school thing, I would say one of the things that's been particularly important in Massachusetts, which we should celebrate the heck out of, and certainly Pioneer Institute ought to do that, is the engagement of private citizens and private money in helping to basically drive what's happened. Been hugely important. And had it not been for that, I don't know enough about all the other states. I'm now having some fun these days going around and seeing what's happening in other states. I don't claim to be an expert on that. But in Massachusetts, when you think about the ingredients of what has helped to make our efforts here, I think, so uniquely special and distinct as it relates to charter schools, it has been a lot of that private engagement and investment of resources and time. And it's been extremely important. And not every state is in a position where they're going to have the ability to replicate that. So anyway.
I would just like to add, not that I'm a Johnny One Note here, there is one factor that hasn't been mentioned, and your question is a very good one. Why are charter schools in Massachusetts doing better than other charter schools, seemingly? And that is the teacher component. Right now, we require in this state that all charter school teachers have to have passed the subject knowledge test. They don't have to be licensed to be a charter school teacher, but they now, and I don't remember the year that came in, but the teachers are, of course, chosen by charter schools to be whoever they want, except that now they have to pass the subject knowledge test. And I will say, based on one particular charter school, the one that specializes in advanced math and science, that had a large controversy about it a number of years ago. But I was in touch with the principal at that time, who told me that when they were advertising for math and science teachers, they had people, and this was when we had a large Russian immigrant population, with people with PhDs, at least master's degrees in math and science, and they were overwhelmingly applying for these positions because they couldn't get licensed. They had not taken our educational courses, but they did have the knowledge needed, and the number who were applying for the one position available, when I looked at the advanced degrees in math and science for that particular group, I was stunned by the quality of the people who were applying for that job who couldn't get into a public school because they would have had to have been licensed. So that, I've never seen a breakdown in this state of the degrees, academic degrees, advanced academic, of those who teach in charter schools. It's just a piece of research evidence that should be at least available so one could see whether that's an important factor or not.
So I want to follow up on this point about teacher quality. Obviously, the effort to raise teacher quality was a critical part of the Education Reform Act. I'm curious, what continues to need to happen today to build on that in terms of improving the quality of teacher preparation? But then I also wanted to ask, there is this national movement to adopt teacher evaluations, and Massachusetts has taken steps in that direction, but is not necessarily regarded as, you know, among the front-runner states in that specific area. And I'm curious what people think of that. Is this a positive reform that Massachusetts should be engaging in? Are the steps that Massachusetts has taken the right ones? How should we be thinking about teacher evaluations as we think about the future of education reform in Massachusetts?
Oh, Sandra, that's you. No, that's you. That's you, Sandra.
I wasn't involved in teacher evaluation. In fact, it was taken right out of my hands at the time. I was starting to rewrite teacher regulations. I thought the yellow book belonged with whatever the color of the other book was, and I was supposed to do them both. And by the time I finished rewriting my first draft of teacher and principal evaluation criteria, I was told that I better not even think of trying to get involved with collective bargaining issues. So that whole yellow book was taken away from me, and all I could do was teacher preparation or administrative preparation. So I can't talk to whatever emerged later on for evaluation of teachers. Certainly there is a need for a stronger system everywhere, but the stronger system would be less needed in terms of it being as onerous as some have made it these days, particularly a major piece of research which suggests an enormous number of visits to every new teacher. But if we had higher admissions standards for both administrators and teachers, doing it at the front end means that you don't have to have the kind of supervision at the other end, which is the experience of other countries that have high bars. Once you let in a higher academic group to begin with, both administrators and teachers, you don't have to invest in the same amount of time for evaluating your teachers. You reduce most of the need. We just haven't figured that one out well, but that's my opinion.
So one thing I like to learn every time, and I learned something today, and I something I hadn't really thought a lot about, and it came out in Senator and the governor's discussions, and that is that this was not just about people who signed off on a law. This is about people who really understood the issues as much as they needed to. They didn't need to get into the details. But when you talk to the governor, you talk to the Senate President, you talk to the Speaker of the House, they really knew these issues. And it reminds me that we need to remember that these things are very complicated. And in today's environment, the response to fix things is to make it, you know, just these quick and dirty things. Like, well, we'll have a third grade guarantee. You see that going on in states around the country. People went into teacher evaluation because Arnie Duncan tied it to the money under Race to the Top. So you've got these knee-jerk very simple kinds of things. Teacher evaluation is very complicated. And by the way, we blame teachers too much. The real weakness of that system is the evaluator, where 96% get good ratings and so forth and so on. But what's the fundamental? The fundamental is, for years, I mean, this goes back 30 years, 40 years, 30 years, that in Tennessee, they figured out, because they had data back then, that if you have an ineffective teacher, if a student has an ineffective teacher 2 years in a row, their entire trajectory of learning is affected. And so it became very, very important to recognize that over time, because they didn't do it for political reasons, it was sociology study, so nobody paid attention to it. And so what happened was they realized, hey, there's a relationship between teachers and student results. Now, it's not that common. I mean, most kids, by the way, make about a year's growth in a year. And most teachers get kids up about a year's growth. And Andrew Joseph will tell you, as a great online math program, they lose it all over the summer, by the way, particularly poor kids. And they do that for 12 years, which we never address. So this issue of tying teacher performance to student results is the right thing to do, but it's complicated. And some teacher who has a kid whose father died in the middle of the year and the kid falls apart, it shouldn't be penalized. I mean, there are ways to do this logically. But unfortunately, Sarah, these things are just knee-jerk. So in order to get the money for Race to the Top, you had to say, we're going to have a teacher evaluation system, and we're going to tie the teacher part of the evaluation to student results. And then everybody promised the moon to get the money. And then when they got the money, and it happened in state after state after state, Delaware, Tennessee, even here, then the real negotiations started. Well, we really didn't mean 50%, well, maybe 40%, well, maybe it'll be whatever. So again, we've taken a very complicated issue, and we've just, we've just done the political expedient thing. Senator Birmingham mentioned this issue of school committees not getting involved. That was a very deliberate process, thought out well, to said, hey, look, we can't have these school committee meetings where they're 3 and 4 hours on the assistant track coach. I mean, enough's enough here. So there was a logic behind why it was done, and it was done carefully. So I think that's the problem, Sarah. There's, across the country, there is knee-jerk kind of things. There's these rules like Race to the Top, not well thought out. I will say in Massachusetts they have developed, we'll see what happens to it, at least through Carla Bear, who's terrific, a good system with good principles and so forth. We'll see what happens.
Just a little different perspective. I don't have anywhere near the experience and perspective that the other panelists have on how this works. I think we're making progress. But I would say that I think sometimes we make this just way too complicated, particularly trying to do it at a sort of macro level. That, and I understand why that's got to happen, but if we were in a position where we could get more and more authority to those individual administrators and schools, I think a lot of what we know needs to happen with regard to how you evaluate and make good decisions about your teams would start happening. Trying to do this at the level we're trying to do it at not only complicates it and makes it very difficult to try to come up with a strategy that will ever work, and I think it just misleads people and sets expectations that are unrealistic about what's likely to happen.
I think Tripp's right. A lot of these processes that we see states engaged in are unbelievably cumbersome and prescriptive, limiting both the principal's ability to deal with the ongoing responsibilities of the office, but also being intrusive into classrooms that frankly don't need to be evaluated because the people are doing a good enough job, and you know that both from the observations, general observations in the school environment, and also test scores and everything else that goes on in school lives. I do think that this issue about evaluations has been oftentimes defined as being a teacher issue. It's not. It's a management issue, and we haven't been doing the right things about creating the kind of systems to make sure that those people have the competencies to do that. And the final thing is that we need to drive the issue about teacher quality back up the system, not, you know, in terms of, you know, these data-driven, you know, Duncan-driven systems, but in terms of making sure that we know what schools are producing good teachers and what schools may not be. And for no other reason than we need to figure out whether or not we need to be replicating some models of teacher preparation and perhaps diminishing our approval of others, putting the approval process of teacher preparation on some sort of scale that would be able to judge whether or not people are in fact appropriately assigned. I mean, I think Massachusetts established a math test under your tenure, was that right? And then the results came back under the next commissioner, if I recall correctly. And yet, you know, I've seen some data that shows that, you know, teachers are still not passing that math test for elementary teachers in the kind of numbers that you would expect. But there's no consequences. You know, there are no consequences other than to the student. And I think that needs to be some thought about, you know, what we're doing about that so that we make the system more effective and efficient.
I was just going to add one small personal anecdote about the importance of the points that have been raised about sort of getting more autonomy back to the local level and reducing the amount of policy or regulations or whatever comes from the top level. My children all went to Brookline High School years ago, and at one time we had what I thought was a great headmaster, Carmen Rinaldi, who spent time, he had been a teacher earlier and then was a headmaster for many years, and as part of his own responsibilities went into classrooms to evaluate new teachers and give them advice on whatever he saw. But he saw that as a major responsibility for him as a headmaster. And after a few years, when more and more paperwork and directives came from both the state and the federal level, he said he no longer had the time to go into the classrooms to visit these new teachers that he was always hiring. And so that disappeared, and I'm sure that must have taken place many other high schools as well. I mean, there's a cost to these regulations and that personal relationship that one would expect.
So I want to open it up for questions and answers with the audience now. We're going to have a mic going around. When you get the mic, please stand up, state your name, if you have an affiliation, that affiliation, and please do ask a question that, as I believe the Common Core standards ask very young children to learn, ends in a question mark.
Fine. My name is Alan Steinert. I'm on the board of a very successful charter school. And before I ask my question, this is a sidebar. Well, I'll skip it. I'll go directly to the question. One thing we haven't talked about in our celebration of the success of Massachusetts is the achievement gap. We, in our charter school, which is very successful, we have not successfully closed the achievement gap. Does anybody have any ideas about how we're going to do that?
Courageous panel. Well, I think you have to recognize, I mean, the good thing in Massachusetts, all boats rose, so that's a good thing, right? So everybody got better, it's just the gap stayed, and in some cases it gets exacerbated. I think we need to look at fundamental changes. Early childhood was mentioned earlier, that's one of them. I mean, kids, I mean, it's a scientific fact about the development of the brain. So if we don't do something in this Commonwealth and invest in kids in this country, in very young kids, and they're sponges, so that's a huge thing. And we haven't done anything in early childhood. We get a lot of lip service. Every year the legislature signs off, great, 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 no money. And it's been that way for a long, long time. So first of all, I think until we address it early, it's gonna, and that's why the third grade reading. The other is this thing I mentioned about the summer loss. Kids don't go home the poor kids don't go home. If you look at the characteristics of poor kids and their families, which is what, I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, it's like two countries. It's crazy. These kids go home to no books, no whatever. And so they have 12 years of summer loss. And it's worse in math than it is in reading, by the way, because they sort of do some reading. I don't know what they read, marijuana packages, I don't know. But they read something. They don't do any math. So all of these fundamentals we have not adjusted our system. And it's really sad to think that other countries that aren't democracies, really pay a lot of attention. I mean, look at Singapore. As a country that pays attention. They make sure that these kids go longer school days, longer school years, whatever, and they spend extra money for those kids. We haven't made that commitment. And so until we fundamentally change the conditions by which these kids are learning, then they're going to continue to, and it takes social service agencies. This can't just be solved by schools. How many kids come to school without a breakfast? Thank goodness we're finally doing that. Sometimes when a kid leaves a school at lunch, that's the last meal they have till they have breakfast the next day. And teachers are supposed to change that and get the kid to learn calculus? I mean, come on. So we've got to fundamentally make a decision as a society that we're going to address it. And how long we can continue with almost third world country cities. Go into some of your, I have the advantage of, I don't know if it's an advantage, and it's not just Detroit, it can be Springfield, it can be Dayton, Ohio. I mean, it's disgraceful. Boarded up houses, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, we've got a huge problem in this country. It's reflected in the schools, and we ask the schools to solve it on their own. Can't be done.
So, real quickly, I know there are other questions. Great point. I don't think we should minimize the importance of what Commissioner Driscoll said about having gotten a lot of kids who are on the bottom rungs up. But I would say the answer to your question about how we do that goes back to what Governor Weld was saying when he was talking about what's being done in places like the Harlem Children's Zone. And we got to be honest about that. I mean, we do have schools that have, as schools, closed the achievement gap, but they've done it normally with all kinds of outside private engagement, leveraging third parties and private money and all kinds of additional services. And I would argue, as a guy who believes in the role of government, that we've got to get much more ambitious around what we expect out of private initiative as a partner, leveraging private resources and private ingenuity and entrepreneurism to partner with a public system to try to be able to do for those children who are struggling what we all know needs to be done. More resources, more time, and a heck of a lot more support and help for parents, not just the kids, and others. And we've got to be, I would say, as a progressive society, completely open to and ambitious about trying to expand our expectations and use of private initiative as a way to help.
Tim Smith. Quick question. I believe that we're producing still far too many adolescent and teenage youth that are disconnected and disengaged, that become disconnected and disengaged young adults. And the national conversation has come to focus very heavily on earlier intervention, which I think is appropriate. But I would like to hear more about how policy thinking is evolving in intervening in the lives of adolescents and teenage youth that are disconnected and disengaged and becoming disconnected and disengaged young adults. So where's the policy discussion there, and where's the innovation there?
So I served on the 12th grade commission for NAEP, and we recommended that in addition to 4th and 8th grade that we test 12th graders, which we now do. And one of the great fears, both of the commission and everybody else, was these kids aren't going to try. They're seniors in high school. Why would they take a test that's sampled? They don't get results. They're just, you know. And amazingly, the kids do try, and we're getting valid, reliable results. So tribute to some of our kids across the country who feel that. They've done surveys of high schools forever, and the #1 complaint, beyond clicks, beyond food, the cafeteria, whatever, now bullying. The #1 complaint of American kids for years, high school kids, has been we're bored and we see no connection between what we're learning and what we're going to need in life. What an indictment. So I think the first thing that we have to do is recognize engagement. And so one of the big debates, and I know that it was one of the questions and one of the things that Pioneer Institute talks about, is all of these issues which business wants, critical thinking, problem solving, those kinds of things. And I don't know where it happened that those things became separated from high standards. I want to tell you, I was the first, as commissioner, we were the first state to sign on to the 21st century skills. Now, first of all, I can't stand that they call them the 21st century skills. It's like Ben Franklin wasn't a creative thinker. Secondly, they kept talking about soft skills. I said, stop talking about them as if they're soft skills. We want hard skills, whatever the hell they are. So these kinds of issues, critical thinking and problem solving and cooperative learning, those should be embedded in high standards. And so kids are engaged. Look at what happens. You talk about our vocational schools. Well, look what happens when these kids get involved in something they get excited about. They learn in spite of themselves. They go home and learn. And so that's what's missing for our adolescents. We are running a school system that was meant back in the day, and we've got these kids today. I mean, just think about it. Here they are going to school. They've got, even the poor kids of America have smartphones, all of them. And they come in, they're texting, they're this, they're that, they're probably doing bad things, whatever, and we say to them, shut off your phones, you're in school. And then we bore the hell out of them. And then what's the first thing they do? Turn their phone on. Well, you know, it'd be great when they automatically turn their phone off because they're so excited when they get to school. That's the problem.
Could I just add something? I'm sorry. To add the whole question of giving young adolescents options for the kind of 9 to 12 experience they would like is simply absent at a national level, and I can't account for it except for this notion that they've all got to go to college, which doesn't solve the problem at all. It simply defers the problem for another 4 to 5 years. And that needs much more discussion than it's had, because if you have adolescents in your own family, you know that once kids decide on something they want to work for, they're more motivated and engaged for what they've chosen. But for some reason, we simply don't see these different options with the high standards embedded, as Commissioner Driscoll said, which is what we did here in Massachusetts, to make sure that there's no avoiding that, but to give them the options of those who happen to prefer to work with their hands as opposed to those who want to do more reading and writing. There's no reason why we have to prevent students from having options at an age where they can make a choice but not be locked in. And that's the whole secret to it.
My name is Isa Zimmerman, and when I was superintendent, one of my 3 superintendencies was when the charter school movement started. Excuse me. One of the features of the charter school legislation, if that's the correct term, was that any innovation in the charter schools that was vetted would then be promulgated, or at least suggested, across the rest of the school districts, the rest of the school system. I experienced such an event when I was in Acton and Acton-Boxborough from the Francis Parker Charter School. But I haven't seen it as a general action in too many other parts of the state. So my question is, what happened to that piece of that intention that I believe was partly what made charter schools so attractive to so many people?
I'm not sure. I think that, frankly, charter schools oftentimes do open the doors and invite people in. I was up at the Lawrence Charter School, Lawrence Family Day, you know, and I think that I've got the right school, and they, and I asked the people there, you know, when you have your open houses, when you have your times when you send out broadcasts to invite educators to come visit, how many superintendents, you know, do you have? And they'd been open 10 years when I was up visiting them, and they had had none. They had had maybe 1 or 2 school committee members. They did have teachers come by and talk to them, and you know, and they had periodically these days where they would just open up and allow educators to either schedule visits or just stop by. I think the schools probably do a pretty good job individually doing that. I don't think that collectively perhaps we do that as well, but I'm not sure. I think this goes to something that Dave said earlier. We used to have charter school advocates in the charter school office. I'm not sure that they're there in the same numbers or have the same freedom that they had before. And so, you know, I think that the examples are floating around out there. I think that the schools can be open and oftentimes are at various times for that kind of, you know, and the charter schools accept that responsibility as being models of innovation.
Well, I think on that note, I'll close out our panel and turn it back over to Jim.
Again, I'd like to thank Tom Birmingham, Bill Weld for being with us. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to the panelists for a fantastic job. One final comment I'd like to make, and it goes back to Alan's question about how to close the achievement gap. None of this is easy. I think the commissioner's point earlier that people come up with one reaction, say we have the silver bullet. There is no silver bullet. The law, in all its complication, is masterful in terms of touching all the needed points. We need to recommit ourselves to that. I would say the good news in all this, there's good and bad news. The good news is charter schools, there are many that are closing the achievement gap and faster. And the Stanford Credo report, the Boston Foundation report, many Pioneer reports show that. Second thing is we have vocational, Sandy was talking about this before, our regional vocational technical schools are awesome. And the fact is our urban vocational technical schools need to have that freedom to work in the school-based way that was intended in the law. For Madison Park in Boston, it's a huge win if we could do that. I think Charlotte Golar-Ritchie was here earlier. If she's still here, that's a great thing to run on, right? We also have some great models underway. Lawrence has cut 25% of its district office, redeploying the money back to the schools, to the classrooms. Many superintendents could do that. And the final thing is, we're talking about vocational technical learning. Man, we've got to do a much better job. We're 10 years behind some states. Massachusetts should certainly not be there. So there are many things we can do that are either proven or at our hands, and we can do that. Thank you for being here and for being committed to this issue. We look forward to seeing you in the future.